He was exhausted. He was desperate. He was broke. $47. That was everything left in his wallet after paying the electric bill. $47 to keep food on the table for him and his daughter Clara until his next job came through. $47 to prove he could still be the father she deserved. A client had called that morning, voice rushed and panicked. Said his Mercedes had overheated somewhere near the old quarry road. Said he was late for a business meeting and would pay cash, good cash, if Caleb could get there within the hour. He'd leave the keys hidden and send payment immediately. So Caleb had kissed his 9-year-old daughter goodbye, left her with Mrs. Chun from the apartment upstairs, and driven 15 miles into the middle of nowhere with hope burning in his chest like fever. Hope was all Caleb had left these days. But the Mercedes wasn't there. He'd pulled over at the designated mile marker, killed the engine, and stepped out into air so thick it felt solid. Nothing. Just the distant hum of cicadas and the whisper of dying grass in the breeze. He'd checked his phone, 2 bars, but the client's number went straight to a disconnected line. Caleb closed his eyes and let his shoulders sag. Again. Life had been playing this game with him ever since the divorce papers were signed. Ever since his ex-wife took half of everything and left him scrambling to keep the garage doors open. Every time he reached for something stable, something real, it turned to smoke in his hands. He was a man standing at the edge of survival, and he knew it. He turned to climb back into his truck when something caught his eye near the roadside ditch. A splash of tan fabric against the brown earth. At first he thought it was trash, maybe clothes someone had dumped. Then he saw the arm, motionless and pale, and his chest seized. Caleb forgot his disappointment. He forgot his exhaustion. He forgot everything except the figure lying crumpled in the dust like something the world had given up on. His work boots pounded against the gravel as he ran, years of basic first aid training, what little the military had taught him before his discharge, flooding back to the surface. There, collapsed on her side with long brown hair fanned across her face, was a young woman who looked like she hadn't drawn a real breath in hours. She wore a dusty tan t-shirt and dark jeans, both stained with road grime and desperation. Her lips were cracked and colorless. Her skin had that waxy, translucent quality that spoke of dangerous dehydration. Caleb dropped to his knees beside her, his weathered hands hovering over her still form. "Miss, can you hear me?" No response. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck. The pulse was there, but faint and rapid like a bird's heartbeat. She was alive, but barely. His eyes darted to his truck, to the single-gallon jug of water on the passenger seat. His last gallon. The water he'd been rationing to last until Friday. The water that meant Clara would have something to drink with her cereal tomorrow morning. Fear clawed at him. He had no money for emergencies, no safety net, no resources to spare. He was a struggling single father with his own daughter to feed and nothing left to give. But something deeper than fear rose inside him. Something that remembered who he used to be before life ground him down to nothing. He couldn't leave her. Caleb ran back to his truck and grabbed the water jug, his hands trembling as he unscrewed the cap. He returned to her side, cradling her head gently, tilting it just enough to let the water trickle past her cracked lips. "Stay with me," he whispered, watching her throat work to swallow. "You're going to be okay. I've got you." When he lifted her, she was light, too light, like something had already hollowed her out from the inside. She leaned against him with complete trust, a stranger putting her faith in a man who barely had faith in himself. Her head rolled against his shoulder as he carried her to his truck, and for a moment, in the dying afternoon light, she looked almost peaceful. He laid her across the bench seat and drove toward town, checking her breathing every few seconds in his rearview mirror. 23 minutes to the nearest clinic. 23 minutes of watching her chest rise and fall, of praying to a God he'd stopped believing in years ago, of wondering what kind of life had led this young woman to collapse alone on an empty road. What Caleb didn't know was that he had just saved the missing heir to the largest land trust in Maryland. He didn't know that powerful men in expensive suits were already hunting for her. He didn't know that his $47 and his cracked water jug were about to become the keys to exposing a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of local government. All he knew was that he had stopped. He had shared his last drop of water with a stranger. He had chosen compassion over survival. And that single choice was about to change everything for him, for his daughter, and for the corrupt forces already circling his neighborhood like vultures. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going. The morning started like every other morning in Caleb's shrinking world, with the metallic taste of desperation and the weight of unpaid bills pressing against his chest like a physical thing. He stood in the cramped kitchenette behind Murphy's garage, watching Clara pour the last of their cereal into a chipped bowl, her small hands steady despite the tremor in his own. 9 years old, and already she moved with the careful economy of someone who understood that nothing could be wasted. "Daddy, Mrs. Chun says her car is making that grinding noise again," Clara said, not looking up from her breakfast. "Maybe she'll pay us this time." Caleb managed a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe, sweetheart. You finish eating and get your backpack. School bus comes in 20 minutes. Through the grimy window, he could see the garage bays yawning empty in the morning light. 3 months behind on rent. 2 months behind on utilities. The bank notice crumpled in his pocket felt heavier than the wrench in his belt. He was drowning in slow motion, and Clara was the only thing keeping his head above water. His reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a man who'd aged 10 years in the last 2. Salt and pepper stubble, lines carved deep around hazel eyes that had seen too much disappointment. The navy blue jumpsuit hung loose on his frame. He'd lost weight he couldn't afford to lose. But his hands were still steady, still strong. That had to count for something. The phone rang as he was checking the ancient register for any cash he might have forgotten. The voice on the other end was clipped, professional, urgent. "Murphy's garage? I need a tow truck. Fast. My Mercedes overheated on Route 40, about 15 miles east of town, near the old quarry access road." Caleb's pulse quickened. "I can be there in 30 minutes. What's the? I'll pay double your usual rate. Cash. I'm late for a flight, so I'll leave the keys under the front mat. Just get it back to town and I'll wire payment within the hour." The line went dead before Caleb could ask for details, but the promise of quick cash was enough. He kissed Clara goodbye, watched her climb onto the yellow school bus with her patched backpack, and fired up his tow truck with something dangerously close to hope beating in his chest. The drive out to the quarry road gave him time to think, time to plan. Double rate meant maybe $300. Enough to buy groceries, enough to keep the lights on another month, enough to prove to Clara that her father wasn't completely defeated yet. The Maryland countryside rolled past his windows. Tobacco fields giving way to scrubland, prosperity fading into the kind of rural poverty that nobody wanted to acknowledge. But when he reached the coordinates, there was no Mercedes, no stranded businessman. Just empty asphalt stretching toward the horizon and the sick realization that he'd been played again. Caleb sat in his idling truck, staring at the heat shimmer rising from the road, feeling the familiar weight of failure settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. That's when he saw it. A strange flicker of movement in his side mirror, something that didn't belong in the static landscape of drought-brown grass and abandoned farmland. He adjusted the mirror, squinting against the afternoon glare, and there it was again. Something pale against the dark earth of the roadside ditch. Caleb shifted into reverse and back down the shoulder, gravel crunching under his tires. What he'd taken for discarded clothing resolved into something that made his blood freeze. Person. A young woman, collapsed in the weeds like something the world had forgotten. He was out of the truck and running before conscious thought caught up with him, his work boots slipping on the loose stones as he scrambled down the shallow embankment. She lay on her side, one arm flung out toward the road as if she'd been trying to crawl toward help. Long brown hair obscured most of her face, but what he could see was pale as bleached bone. Her breathing came in shallow, desperate sips. "Jesus!" he whispered, dropping to his knees beside her. "Miss, can you hear me?" No response. Her pulse fluttered under his fingertips like a dying butterfly. Dehydration, maybe heatstroke. In this kind of weather, either one could kill. His eyes went to the gallon jug of water sitting in his truck's cab. The water he'd been nursing since yesterday morning, rationing it like liquid gold. The calculation was brutal and immediate. That water was supposed to last him and Clara through Friday. It was the difference between his daughter having something to drink with her meals and going thirsty. But this woman was dying, and he was the only person who could save her. Caleb didn't hesitate. Not really. The choice had already been made the moment he saw her lying there, abandoned and alone. He ran back to his truck, grabbed the water jug, and returned to kneel beside her still form. With infinite gentleness, he lifted her head and trickled water past her cracked lips, watching her throat work to swallow. "That's it," he murmured. "Easy now. You're safe." She was impossibly light when he lifted her, like something already halfway to disappearing. He settled her in the passenger seat of his truck, her head lolling against the worn vinyl, and drove toward town with his heart hammering against his ribs. In the rearview mirror, her chest rose and fell with increasing steadiness. The water was working. By the time they reached the outskirts of town, she was stirring, eyelids fluttering open to reveal dark eyes that held depths he couldn't fathom. She looked at him with confusion that slowly gave way to something like recognition, not of his face, but of what he'd done for her. "Where?" Her voice came out as barely a whisper. "You're safe," Caleb said. "I'm taking you somewhere you can rest." She nodded and closed her eyes again, trust radiating from her like heat. That trust terrified him more than anything else. The weight of being responsible for someone else's life when he could barely manage his own. The garage sat at the end of a dead-end street, a squat concrete building with bay doors that hadn't opened for paying customers in weeks. Above it, connected by an external staircase, was the apartment where he and Clara made their home. 2 rooms, a bathroom, and a kitchenette under a rusted tin roof that leaked when the storms came hard. Clara was already home from school, sitting on the front steps with her homework spread across a cardboard box that served as a desk. She looked up as Caleb pulled in, her eyes immediately fixing on the stranger in the passenger seat. "Daddy!" Clara stood slowly, her young face creased with worry. "Who is that?" Caleb shut off the engine and sat for a moment, gathering his thoughts. How did you explain to a 9-year-old that you'd just used up your last resources to save someone you'd never met? How did you make her understand that sometimes doing the right thing meant making everything harder? "Someone who needs our help," he said finally, stepping out of the truck. "Just for a little while." The young woman, she'd whispered her name was Saffron during the drive, managed to walk with his support, though she leaned heavily against his shoulder. Clara watched from the bottom of the stairs, her dark eyes taking in every detail with the sharp perception that came from growing up too fast. "She can have my bed," Clara said quietly. "I'll sleep on the couch." Caleb's throat constricted. His daughter had so little, and yet she was willing to give up even that without being asked. "You sure, baby?" Clara nodded gravely. "She looks like she needs it more than me." That evening, with Saffron sleeping in Clara's narrow bed and his daughter curled up on the threadbare couch, Caleb sat in the dark kitchenette and tried to figure out what happened next. His last gallon of water was gone. His last hope of quick cash had evaporated. But something had changed in the moment he'd chosen to stop on that empty road. Something that felt bigger than his own survival. He was still sitting there when the black SUV made its first pass. The headlights swept across his windows like searchlights, moving too slowly to be casual traffic. Caleb eased himself out of his chair and peered through the edge of the curtain. The vehicle was expensive, pristine, completely out of place in this forgotten corner of Maryland. It cruised past the garage once, twice, then disappeared into the night. But Caleb knew it would be back. Over the next 2 days, Saffron grew stronger. Color returned to her cheeks, and she began helping around the garage with quiet determination. She had soft hands, hands that had never known real labor, but she learned quickly and never complained. Clara took to her immediately, chattering about school and friends while Saffron listened with the kind of attention that suggested she'd forgotten what it was like to be part of a family. The black SUV returned twice more, always at different times, always moving with that same predatory slowness. Men in navy suits sat behind tinted windows, and Caleb began keeping his old hunting rifle closer to hand. On the third evening, as they sat around the folding table that served as their dining room, Saffron's hand went unconsciously to her throat. For the first time, Caleb noticed the thin chain there, mostly hidden beneath her shirt. Her fingers worried at something small and hard. A locket, he realized. "I keep having dreams," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the comfortable silence. Fragments. A big house. Men in expensive suits. The sound of breaking glass. Clara looked up from her coloring book. Dreams about what? About who I used to be. Saffron's fingers found the clasp of the locket. It opened with a soft click, revealing not a photograph but something that made Caleb's blood run cold. A folded piece of paper, old and yellowed, covered in official seals and legal language. "What is that?" Clara asked, leaning closer. Saffron smoothed the paper carefully, her hands trembling slightly. I think it's a deed. To land. A lot of land." Her eyes met Caleb's across the table. "I think someone tried to kill me for this." Caleb read the faded text, his heart sinking with each line. Sterling Family Trust. Mineral rights. Water rights. Development restrictions. And at the bottom, a signature that made everything click into terrible place. Margaret Sterling, dated just 6 months ago. "Sterling," he said quietly. "As in Sterling Development? The company that's been buying up half the county." Saffron nodded, memory flooding back like a dam breaking. "Margaret Sterling was my grandmother. She left me everything when she died. But her lawyer said the will was being contested. Said I should lay low until it was sorted out. That's why I was on that road. I was trying to get to the courthouse in Baltimore, to file some kind of motion, but she didn't need to finish. Someone had made sure she never reached Baltimore. Someone who stood to lose millions if her claim to the Sterling estate was legitimate. Outside, another set of headlights swept past the window, but this time they slowed to a stop. The car doors slammed shut with the kind of authority that belonged to men who'd never been told no. Caleb moved to the window, his daughter instinctively pressing closer to his side while Saffron went rigid at the table. The deed still spread between her trembling fingers. 3 men emerged from the black SUV, but it was the 4th figure that commanded attention. He stepped out of the lead vehicle like he owned the ground beneath his feet. Tall, silver-haired, wearing a royal blue suit that probably cost more than Caleb's truck. His polished shoes clicked against the cracked asphalt as he approached the garage, flanked by his associates whose navy suits and calculating eyes screamed corporate security. Caleb opened the door before they could knock, stepping onto the small landing with his shoulders squared. Below him, the man in the royal blue suit looked up with the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "Mr. Murphy," the man said, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. "My name is Richard Blackwood. I believe you have something that belongs to me." "I don't have anything that belongs to you," Caleb replied, keeping his voice steady despite the way his pulse hammered against his throat. Blackwood's smile widened. "The young woman you're harboring, Miss Sterling, she's unwell, suffering from delusions brought on by a recent trauma. Her family is very concerned about her welfare." Behind Caleb, he heard the soft scrape of chair legs against linoleum. Saffron had stood up, though she remained out of sight from the men below. Clara had moved to stand beside her, small and fierce, ready to protect their unexpected guest. "She seems fine to me," Caleb said, "and she's free to leave any time she wants." "I'm afraid it's not quite that simple." Blackwood reached into his jacket and withdrew a leather checkbook, the kind that spoke of unlimited resources. "Miss Sterling is the beneficiary of a complex estate. There are irregularities in the documentation she carries, legal challenges that need to be resolved before she can make any decisions about her inheritance." The man opened the checkbook with a flourish, producing a gold pen that caught the dying light. "I'm prepared to compensate you generously for the trouble she's caused. The Sterling family values discretion." He wrote something on the check, tore it free, and held it up. The amount was blank, but his meaning was crystal clear. "Name your price, Mr. Murphy. Whatever you need to make your life easier. A new garage, perhaps? Enough money to send your daughter to the finest schools? All you have to do is walk away." Caleb stared at the check, at the promise of everything he'd been struggling toward for months. Financial security, a future for Clara, an end to the constant fear of losing everything. Then he thought about Saffron's trust, the way she'd looked at him with eyes that held no deception, only gratitude. He thought about the deed hidden in her locket, about the men who'd left her to die on an empty road, about what would happen to her if he took Blackwood's money. Caleb reached down and pushed the check away, his oil-stained fingers leaving prints on the pristine paper. "My integrity isn't for sale," he said quietly. "And neither is she." Blackwood's smile finally faded. The mask of civilized negotiation slipped, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "I'm disappointed, Mr. Murphy. I'd hoped we could resolve this matter amicably. We have." She stays. "I don't think you understand the full scope of what you're refusing." Blackwood folded the check carefully, returning it to his jacket. "Miss Sterling is suffering from severe psychological trauma. She's constructed elaborate fantasies about inheritance and conspiracy. In her current state, she could be dangerous, to herself, to your daughter." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Caleb's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Are you threatening my family? I'm offering you one last chance to be reasonable." Blackwood stepped back, his security team moving with practiced precision to flank him. "Think carefully about your next decision, Mr. Murphy. A man in your position can't afford to make enemies." They left as smoothly as they'd arrived, the SUV disappearing into the gathering dusk. But Caleb knew it wasn't over. Men like Blackwood didn't accept defeat gracefully. The attack came from an unexpected direction, not violence but something worse. The next morning, Clara ran up the stairs with tears streaming down her face, clutching a newspaper she'd found on the front step. "Daddy, why are they saying these things about you?" The headline hit Caleb like a physical blow. "Local mechanic suspected of harboring kidnapping victim." Below it, a grainy photograph showed him helping Saffron from his truck, the image cropped and angled to look sinister. The article painted him as a predator, a desperate man who'd taken advantage of a traumatized young woman for his own twisted purposes. "It's lies, baby," he said, pulling Clara close. "All of it." But the damage was already spreading. By noon, his phone had rung a dozen times. Reporters, concerned citizens, anonymous callers hurling accusations. Mrs. Chun from upstairs knocked on his door, her face creased with worry. "Caleb, people are talking. They're saying terrible things. Maybe the girl should go to the authorities, just until this gets sorted out." Even his neighbors, people who'd known him for years, were beginning to doubt. Saffron watched it all with growing guilt, the weight of what her presence had brought down on his family evident in every line of her face. "I should leave," she said that evening after Clara had gone to bed. "I never meant for this to happen to you." "Where would you go?" Caleb asked. "Back to that ditch? Back to whoever tried to kill you?" She had no answer because they both knew the truth. She had nowhere else to run, no one else to trust. The deed in her locket was the only proof of her identity, the only thing standing between her and whatever fate Blackwood had planned. The siege began the next morning. They came in 3 vehicles, parking strategically to block both ends of the dead-end street. Not Blackwood this time, but men with the kind of faces that belonged in mugshots, hired muscle dressed in cheap suits and expensive attitudes. They didn't approach the garage directly. Instead, they set up a perimeter, making it clear that no one was leaving without their permission. Caleb called the police, but the response was lukewarm at best. "We'll send someone when we can," the dispatcher said, her tone suggesting that the controversial mechanic wasn't high on their priority list. Hours passed. Clara couldn't go to school. Caleb couldn't leave for work. Not that he had any jobs lined up anyway. They were trapped in their own home, prisoners of a man who commanded resources beyond anything Caleb could match. By afternoon, the pretense of civility had worn thin. One of the men, a bull-necked thug with prison tattoos creeping up his collar, approached the garage with a crowbar in his hand. "Time to be reasonable," he called up to the apartment. "Boss wants the girl. You can hand her over easy, or we can come up and get her." Caleb appeared at the top of the stairs, his hunting rifle cradled in his arms. "This is private property. You need to leave." The man laughed, a sound like grinding metal. "You gonna shoot all of us, old man? 'Cause that's what it's gonna take." That's when Caleb realized they weren't just blocking his street. They were counting on his reluctance to escalate. They figured a desperate mechanic with a daughter to protect wouldn't risk a gunfight. They figured wrong. "Clara, get in the bathroom and lock the door," he said without taking his eyes off the men below. "Saffron, call 911 again. Tell them shots are about to be fired." The first man reached the bottom of the stairs just as Caleb clicked off the safety. The sound echoed in the evening air like a judgment. "This is your last warning," Caleb said, his voice carrying the kind of authority he'd learned in the military before life had ground him down to nothing. "Leave now or I start shooting." But they kept coming, confidence born of numbers and arrogance overriding caution. The bull-necked man took another step up, crowbar raised, and Caleb squeezed the trigger. The shot went high, shattering a window in the garage below, but the message was clear. The men scattered, taking cover behind their vehicles, but they didn't leave. Instead, they began coordinating, preparing for a more serious assault. That's when the neighborhood arrived. Mrs. Chun came first, armed with nothing but indignation and a rolling pin. Then Mr. Rodriguez from down the street, carrying a baseball bat and looking grimmer than Caleb had ever seen him. More neighbors emerged from houses and apartments, people who'd watched the news reports with growing skepticism, who'd known Caleb Murphy long enough to recognize character assassination when they saw it. "You boys need to move along, Mrs. Chan announced, her slight frame radiating the kind of authority that came from raising 5 sons. "This is a decent neighborhood, and we don't tolerate bullies." The thugs found themselves surrounded by ordinary people who decided they'd seen enough. Housewives and retirees, teenagers and shop owners, all united by the simple understanding that sometimes you had to stand up to power, even when you were afraid. When the police finally arrived, it was to find Blackwood's men facing down an impromptu block party that had somehow turned into a siege in reverse. The hired muscle, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, had no choice but to withdraw. But Caleb knew it wasn't over. Blackwood had resources, connections, and the kind of patience that came from playing a longer game. The truth needed to come out, all of it, before another night fell. The town council meeting that Thursday night was packed beyond capacity. Every seat filled and people standing 3 deep along the walls. Word had spread about the controversy on Maple Street, about the mysterious young woman and the mechanic who'd risked everything to protect her. Cameras from 3 local news stations captured every moment as Saffron Sterling walked to the podium, the deed from her locket clutched in her trembling hands. She told her story simply, without dramatics or embellishment. The grandmother who'd raised her after her parents died. The inheritance that included mineral rights to half the county. The lawyer who'd told her to stay hidden while the will was contested. The men who'd beaten her and left her to die when she tried to reach the courthouse on her own. "Richard Blackwood has been systematically acquiring land throughout this county," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Land that legally belongs to the Sterling Family Trust. Land that he knew would revert to public ownership if I died without heirs." The pieces clicked together with devastating clarity. The mysterious development deals. The properties purchased well below market value. The environmental restrictions that had mysteriously disappeared from zoning ordinances. All of it orchestrated by a man who stood to make millions from a dead woman's legacy. When Blackwood stood to respond, his polished demeanor had cracks showing around the edges. "This young woman is clearly disturbed," he said. "The documents she's presented are forgeries. The Sterling estate was settled months ago according to proper legal procedures." That's when the real bombshell dropped. Margaret Sterling's original lawyer, the one Blackwood claimed had handled the estate, walked through the back doors of the council chambers. He'd been following the news coverage from his retirement in Florida, and what he'd seen had brought him north on the first available flight. "I never handled any Sterling estate settlement," the elderly attorney announced. "Margaret Sterling died intestate, leaving everything to her granddaughter. I have the original documents in my briefcase, along with correspondence from Mr. Blackwood's associates attempting to bribe me to alter my testimony." The room erupted. Cameras flashed. Council members called for order while Blackwood's face went white as bone. In the space of 5 minutes, years of careful manipulation had collapsed like a house of cards. The legal machinery moved swiftly after that. Blackwood was arrested on charges ranging from fraud to attempted murder. The Sterling Trust was restored to its rightful heir, along with reparations for the illegal development that had already taken place. But the best part, the part that made Caleb's chest tight with something he'd almost forgotten was pride, came 3 weeks later. Saffron appeared at his garage on a Wednesday morning, carrying a check and wearing the kind of smile that belonged to someone who'd remembered what hope felt like. "The trust is funding a community development project," she said, pressing the check into his oil-stained hands. "A new community center right here in the neighborhood, with workshops and after-school programs. We need someone to manage the construction, someone who understands what this community really needs." The amount on the check was more money than Caleb had seen in years, but it wasn't charity. It was partnership, investment in a future that included everyone who'd stood with him when standing meant risking everything. Clara burst through the door at that moment, home from school and full of 8-year-old energy. She threw her arms around Saffron first, then her father, chattering about her day and the friends who'd heard their story on the news. "Are we rich now, Daddy?" she asked with the kind of directness that only children could manage. Caleb looked around the garage. Still shabby, still showing its age, but filled now with possibility instead of desperation. Mrs. Chun was teaching Saffron to make dumplings in the upstairs kitchen. Mr. Rodriguez had stopped by with materials for the new community garden they were planning in the empty lot next door. The neighborhood that had rallied to protect them was becoming something stronger, something that felt like family. "We're something better than rich, sweetheart," he said, pulling both his girls close. "We're home." Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going.